scotch, and soda.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 354. This time around, we're talking about a group that I'm guessing a lot of you, particularly if you're metalheads, you've heard of these guys. Dead Can Dance. They might even be somewhat famous to the more normie-minded amongst you, given that half of this musical duo, that being Lisa Gerrard and Brendan Perry. Lisa Gerrard did all the vocal components for the soundtrack in the movie Gladiator.
Scotch and soda.
Along with a whole bunch of other movies, Black Hawk Down, Tears of the Sun, Mission Impossible 2, Man of Steel, hell, even the live-action version of Rurouni Kenshin. I didn't even know there was a live-action version of Rurouni Kenshin.
Kenshin! You big
Point is, I'm guessing pretty much everybody and their mother has heard this broad's voice at least once, even if it was only in a movie trailer for like 5 seconds. But if you're into metal, specifically the more extreme forms of metal, black metal and death metal, particularly black metal, there's a fairly good chance that Dead Can Dance is actually the favorite non-metal musical group of quite a few of the musicians that you listen to. Dead Can Dance has been noted as an influence by both Varg from Burzum.
So, how do you like your cornflakes? You know, do you like them crispy or you like them soft?
And Trey Azagthoth from Morbid Angel.
Like bands that, promote sticking dildos in their ass or something like that. What's that? Is that culture? Is that today's culture?
As well as Max Cavalera from Sepultura. In addition to being a major touchstone for a lot of more underground bands like Disembowelment, Abremelin, Mortis.
Don't you want to live forever, Mortis, with my hamburgers, Mortis?
Pretty much all the dungeon synth. And honestly, Abigor and particularly Summoning probably wouldn't even exist without Dead Can Dance. So yeah.
What's the deal with
Dead Can Dance? Why are all these metal people listening to them if they ain't even a metal band? And more importantly, just what the heck is a Dead Can Dance? Because these guys are a pretty hard project to define. Even the name is kind of strange, but it speaks to their concept as a group, which has kind of always been about moving between life and death and then back into life, kind of making something alive out of something that is dead. For example, the cover of their first album has some kind of tribal mask on it. A mask is made out of dead wood because you cut it out of the tree. The tree's dead, but because you took that dead thing and made it into a mask, conceivably to create some sort of art with, you've taken something that was dead and brought it back to life in a new way. I feel like having that as the idea behind the group, that sort of atavistic impulse, not only informs pretty much all of what Dead Can Dance does, but also appeals a lot to the more deathly and black side of heavy metal. Dead Can Dance started way back in 1981, and they were initially heavily influenced by the post-punk band Joy Division, another group of musicians that isn't really metal in any way, shape, or form, but is claimed as an influence by a whole lot of people that did go on to create metal bands. And while Joy Division was very morbid and dark, it was also pretty much like the cutting edge of music at the time. It went on to influence a lot of what we now call new wave, in addition to darker elements of the musical spectrum. But Dead Can Dance take that Joy Division influence and via that atavistic impulse of bringing back more ancient forms of music, pre-punk, pre-rock and roll, pre-modern stuff, and marrying to what at the time was the cutting edge of the end of punk rock, you end up with a very ancient, otherworldly take on that Joy Division framework. You got songs on that first self-titled album like this one, The Trial, really not that far removed from Joy Division, noisy yet melodious guitar, bass guitar is sort of being the lead melodic component, gloomy vocals kind of floating over everything, mechanical sounding drum beats. Sounds like Joy Division, but then stuff like this happens. The guitar parts get a lot more melodious, almost psychedelic than they ever were in Joy Division, taking on this oddly sort of quasi-ethnic, decrepit music emanating from Atlantis sort of feel. Like this riff right here almost sounds like it could have happened on a Septic Flesh album. The vocalist on this track is Brendan Perry, who later on, when Dead Can Dance stopped being a band and started being a duo, he formed one half of it. So you got your songs where Brendan Perry takes the lead vocals. Then you got your songs where Lisa Gerrard takes the lead vocals. Jeez, did somebody leave a post-black metal album on in the background? Get that fucking Alcest guy out of the studio.
Yeah, he's right there. Okay. Yeah, throw him out. Throw him out into the cold.
Nah, I'm just kidding. This is actually a Dead Can Dance song, I promise. But you could definitely see how this particular take on the Joy Division sound might go on to influence a lot of black metal. It's very atmospheric and soundtracky. Whole lot of flowing, droning melody to it, more so than the very choppy sort of thing you might hear from a band like Joy Division. Definitely could see a lot of space rock people a la Hawkwind being into this shit. And then Lisa Gerard's vocals show up, and I guarantee these are going to be very different from anything you've ever heard. For starters, she doesn't really use real words that often. Instead, she just kind of picks mouth sounds that fit the emotion she's trying to communicate. It's what's known as glossolalia, which, by the way, was the name of a black metal project associated with the Black Twilight Circle in California. Definitely not a coincidence. But yeah, the Lisa Gerard-led tracks on this album leave that Joy Division thing even further behind in favor of the sort of soundtracky thing you just heard. But then you get the songs like this one here, Frontier, very aptly named, because they're very much operating in a space on the frontier, the horizon, the edge of what you can do with post-punk music, to the point where this shit ain't even really post-punk anymore. It's more just some kind of indescribable tribal ambient thing. The percussive component of this track, while not being played on a conventional drum kit, isn't really that far removed from the kind of thing you'd hear in Joy Division. And like with Joy Division, you got these kind of swooshy, weird, swirly use of electronic noises in the background. But instead of doing Joy Division style shit with it, they're using it to give life to ancient and perhaps dead forms of music. Dead Can Dance. That's the whole point of the thing. That's why they named the band that. And post the issue of their 1984 debut self-titled full-length, Dead Can Dance would be moving even more towards the new frontier, leaving the entire concept of a band behind. Everybody leaves except for Lisa Gerard and Brendan Perry. So it becomes less about, oh, we're a band, we're going to play live, do whatever, and more about, we're a couple of composers that put together these arrangements, much like what the black metal band Summoning would end up doing after they stopped being a band after their first album and turned into a duo. And speaking of Summoning and Burzum and all those black metal guys that claim a lot of influence from Dead Can Dance, it's with Dead Can Dance's sophomore album Spleen and Ideal that you can really hear the roots of a lot of the atmospheric stuff that black metal would go on to do. This also happens to, depending on my mood, maybe be my personal favorite Dead Can Dance album. Definitely a really good one to start with if you're new to them. Some of the more post-punky Brendan Perry-led tracks aren't that far removed from the sort of thing they did on their debut album, but even these tracks most adjacent to post-punk are still far removed from anything else going on in that genre, particularly once they start incorporating a lot of non-traditional rock instruments, like the kind of droning horns we've got going on in the background, or this piano that's coming in. That combined with the horns specifically, you could definitely hear a lot of Summoning in that. But honestly, even if Dead Can Dance didn't go on to influence a whole lot of metal that I like to listen to, this song in particular would still be one of my favorite just general songs of all time. It's fucking awesome. But maybe that's still a little too close to conventional rock music for those of you that are really into stuff like Mortis or Summoning. You're wondering, how does this turn into Mortis and Summoning? Well, that's where you got songs like this one, Enigma of the Absolute. With songs like this, you can take most conventional rock music elements and wave
Bye-bye. Wave bye-bye, Grandpa.
because that shit's gone. Check out these fucking timpanis. There we go. That's the fucking roots of Summoning, Mortis, all kinds of shit. Also, a lot of times it seems like people really concentrate on Lisa Gerard's vocals in Dead Can Dance. But honestly, songs like this, Brendan might actually be my favorite. Dude's just got a really cool elegiac voice. Also, the sound layering going on right here, bringing in some suspenseful droning keyboard layers in the back. You could definitely see how this sort of composition would go on to influence Burzum and Summoning bands like that. And then this part with the cello hits, and man is it ever sick.
Yeah, baby!
That's what's known in the industry as that good shit. Like I said earlier, this is maybe my favorite Dead Can Dance album. I'm tempted to keep playing you samples from just all of it, because it's all really fucking good, but we got other stuff to get to. So I'll leave you off with Spleen and Ideal. You got your post-punk songs, you got your big orchestral epics, then you got stuff that goes even further from conventional modern sort of pop music, like the song Ascension, where they're kind of doing this sort of big band thing, but I can't think of any regular modern day band standards that are as droning or atmospheric as this. Heavily emotional stuff, no percussion at all, even further removing itself from conventional popular music of the time and even today. But then the horns drop out. We kind of leave conventional music in general behind in favor of this all-encompassing cosmic drone. Just vocals, a bassy throb, and a wash of cymbals slowed down to where they become unrecognizable. That's a pretty good place to leave off with Spleen and Ideal, because if you ask me, it is the least conventional song on the album, and it's also one that leads even further towards what Dead Can Dance would go on to do. Because the album after this one, even less conventionally rock music oriented than Spleen and Ideal, which was already like a blazing frontier of an album. Within the Realm of a Dying Sun from 1987. This is another candidate for perhaps my favorite Dead Can Dance album. For a not so short period of time when I was in high school, this was actually my favorite album in general, as far as music that didn't go or was concerned. This was the first Dead Can Dance album I ever heard, and it made me into a lifelong fan, so they must have been doing something right with it. And it's another one that functions as an effective entry point into their very unconventional discography, mostly because side A gives you a real good idea of what the Brendan Perry tracks sound like. Side B gives you a real good idea of what the Lisa Gerrard component of Dead Can Dance brings. It's all very digestible, and this album contains some of the best work from both of them. This track right here, actually my favorite Brendan Perry-led Dead Can Dance song of all time, although it starts out with Lisa Gerrard doing her thing, of course, entitled Xavier. Really nice cosmic sounding beginning before we jump into a nice choppy keyboard figure that's very medieval in nature and atmosphere. From there, we get hit with some of Brendan Perry's best vocals ever, on top of some synthesized horn lines that I'm pretty sure the guys in Summoning would kill to have written. Super atmospheric and dark, really well done with the layering of sounds. Vocals get real soulful here. Like I said, some of his best work ever. Very far removed from the post-punk of their earliest material. Although I would argue that if you really listen for it, the repetitive keyboard line in this song still has a bit of Joy Division's DNA in it, specifically with the song like Decades off of the Closer album. Call it gothic rock, neoclassical, darkwave, whatever the fuck. So with this album, Dead Can Dance's sound gets really hard to define. They don't really sound like anyone else except for themselves and bands that are self-consciously imitating what they do. And that goes double for the Lisa Gerrard dominated side of this album. From what I've seen, the most popular song from this side tends to be the song Kantara. And yeah, it's pretty good stuff. Layering in the song is very slow and deliberate, subtle but very impactful. This song in particular has a lot more narrative development and motion to it than is typical for a Dead Can Dance song. Usually they tend to be a little bit more ambient in their focus than this, but I almost want to say that this song is kind of riff-based in a way. It definitely has very clearly delineated musical phrases and sections, such as right here when they dramatically shift tempo. This song also marks the re-emergence of a lot of the tribal sort of thing they were doing on that first album of theirs, albeit in a new, revitalized, and very different form. Again, Dead Can Dance, bringing back dead forms and giving them new life. As you can probably tell right now, Lisa Gerrard's vocals on this one are pretty fucking bonkers. Actually rather aggressive in their own way, savage sounding. Speaking of aggression, check this shit out. The Australian death metal band Bremelin actually covered this Dead Can Dance song on their first album, and it's a testament to the weird savagery of Lisa Gerrard's performance that it does kind of work with distorted guitars and death metal vocals. So yeah, Kantara, pretty cool song, but my personal favorite Lisa Gerrard song from this album, I believe it was the first Dead Can Dance song I ever heard, Summoning of the Muse. Based almost entirely around this repetitive sort of apocalyptic bell sequence going on in the background, over which they layer droning strings and Lisa's inimitable vocals. Perhaps the heaviest Dead Can Dance song ever, and honestly one of just the heaviest songs in general ever, despite not having blast beats or down-tuned guitars. You listen to stuff like this, you understand why a lot of the goth subculture really looks up to Dead Can Dance. I guarantee Mana from Malice Miser's a big fan of this one, particularly when he was composing songs in the post-Gact era that I covered on episode 261 of this program. Jesus, what a fucking voice. The glossolalia thing, mouth sounds without actual lyrics, in full effect on this song and done so wonderfully. Absolutely fits whatever she was going for. And then when the vocals drop out, the horns from Spleen and Ideal make a comeback. the atmosphere becomes even more somber and serious. I can't tell you how much I had to rack my brain to try to make jokes for you guys on this episode, because this is some of the most serious music ever, and I love it for that. Absolutely devoid of irony or any winking at the audience. Good fucking stuff. Whole album is good fucking stuff. But I think we might have time to cover one more Dead Can Dance album this episode, that being the follow-up to my two favorite Dead Can Dance albums from the 80s. 1988's The Serpent's Egg, which isn't really my favorite Dead Can Dance album, but for a lot of people, this is the one they swear by, and you could definitely make a convincing argument for this being the best Dead Can Dance album, depending on what way your tastes go. And what had become something of a pattern for Dead Can Dance at this point, this album moves even further away from conventional rock music towards revival of ancient musical forms. And if you're a black metal kid, even if you hadn't heard any Dead Can Dance before this episode, you may actually be familiar with certain themes from this album, because the first Abigor demo, Ashnag, heavily sampled it, including the following a cappella song, Echolalia. Starts out with some dark tribal chanting from Brendan, responded to by Lisa Gerrard, further developing that more savage tone she discovered on Kantara. Definitely some ultra primitive stuff, and then as the song goes on, the two vocalists kind of tie into each other in an interesting sort of overlapping way. Amazing how dense music can sound when it's made out of nothing but drums and vocals. Speaking of which, finding surprising complexity from simple ingredients, we have the devilishly subtle instrumental, Mother Tongue, being a particular standout of this album for me. The way this particular song utilizes percussion, it's almost like they've managed to give an amelodic instrument like drums a sort of melodic texture and coloring by going through all of these varieties of percussion in different layers and different song sections. The song might not be entirely drum-based. It does include bass and keyboards at various points, but the percussion is definitely the star here. Also, the weird way they're doing the percussion now, like really drawing out these hits to where they almost slide past each other, definitely sounds like the genesis of a lot of what Summoning would do with their drum arrangements, particularly on the Dol Guldur album. Despite all that wackiness, this album isn't entirely just weird sonic experiments. There are more conventional songs on here, including another standout for me as far as Brendan Perry-led songs go, In the Kingdom of the Blind, the One-Eyed Are Kings, which features another really good example of the trademark sort of Dead Can Dance style looped melody, used as a skeleton on which to drop different melodic layers as the song progresses. The way this one builds, sort of like a gradually oncoming storm, almost kind of a post-rock feeling to it, and then it climaxes, bringing in more layers of brass instruments, cranking up the emotionality on Brendan Perry's vocals. It's stunning stuff if you have the ear for it. The lyrics are also very much worth looking up, which tends to be the case with a lot of Brendan Perry-led Dead Can Dance songs, but I'm not really going to get into them. I don't really do lyrical analysis as much as I get into the instrumentation, you know what I'm saying? You listen to this show, you know how it works. And you know, when I talk this much about a multi-album chunk of a band's discography, that there's probably going to be a part 2 for Dead Can Dance. Rest assured, I'm already working on it, so don't worry if one of your favorite Dead Can Dance albums didn't come up this time around. I'm going to get to it next time, I promise. But I'm hoping that if you weren't already into Dead Can Dance, and you're a metal person, you're like, why are these metal guys always talking about this band for? Maybe I've started to elucidate that a bit for you. Maybe I've convinced you to listen to them. If you're not into them, I'm not going to say you're a
Sissy-ass pink panty wearing fucking poser.
Mostly because I feel like Dead Can Dance is above that sort of discourse. But I do have to question your taste in music. Nothing personal. Either way, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
What about when the guy gets hit with that spike thing and chunks of his head go flying?
Enough already.
Make a conversation.
You know, people are trying to eat.
Thank you.